Our guest is Father Leon Hooper, a Jesuit priest from the California province of the Society of Jesus. That's Jesuit priest, Society of Jesus, a little redundancy there. Leon studied at Boston College, where he earned his doctorate on John Courtney Murray, with a focus on the impact that the thought of Bernard Lonergan, another Jesuit, had on Murray's later arguments for religious liberty. In the last few years, Leon has been a research fellow at the Woodstock Theological Center in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University. And he is currently the director of the Woodstock Theological Library, which is a truly great library, which is now part of the Georgetown collections. Prior to that, or during that same time, concurrent with that, he was the book review editor for Theological Studies, which is a major theological journal, also sponsored by the Jesuits. He's currently working on a project gluing John Courtney Murray and Dorothy Day together by using mystical rhetorical analysis on the ways in which Christians and Catholics use negation in understanding their God. So Leon will be giving us some background here on the document Dignitatis Humanae. And then, as is per usual, we'll take a short break, and then we will hear commentary by two other guests whom I'll introduce at that time, Professor David Kennedy of Stanford and David DeCosse of Santa Clara, but I'll keep those introductions till after we hear from Leon. So, Leon, thank you.
Thank you for the generous introduction. One thing you didn't mention that's probably important for knowing where I'm coming from is that I'm Jesuit, but I'm not Roman Catholic. Some of you, is anybody here a Byzantine uniate or belong to one of the other rites of the Roman Catholic Church? No, there are several other rites, and I was, at 1 month of age, I was baptized into Ruthenian rite. I was also, at that 1 month occasion, confirmed and received my first Holy Communion. It meant also that we could eat meat on Friday. I felt sorry for the Romans. They were going to hell because of it, if they did. But of course, that didn't affect us at all. And again, we stood in good stead with the Bishop of Rome. I still make the sign of the cross going that way rather than going this way. I also, at 4 years of age, remember an uncle, married, 10 kids. I remember that they lived in squalor somewhat, who was a priest and recognized again by the Bishop of Rome. And I remember English liturgies, particularly the baptism of my baby sister in about 1948. All of these were gaps that I noticed right from the beginning between what is necessary for salvation and what is necessary to be a Roman Catholic. So if I appear a little bit heterodox today, it's because of that. If I appear a little heretical, it's because my dad was born on mission, Presbyterian mission in the Philippines. So I come from a very mixed background and notices difference very much in approaches to religion. It also, one of the things through my studies as a Jesuit and then beyond the usual ordination theology, I noticed a lot of differences in understandings and affirmations of religious liberty, and that's of course what we're going to talk about today. A second thing, and this is by way of a kickoff, is to focus just a little bit what I'm talking about. I'm talking about religious liberty through this, and it ought to be contrasted with religious freedom. Religious liberty is actually a subset of religious freedom. It's a type of religious freedom. religious freedom generally is either an immunity or an empowerment. As an immunity, it is, that I ought not to be stopped from saying what I want to say or hearing what I want to hear. I ought not to be restricted. I have immunities against those that are being or wanting to restrict me. As an empowerment, empowerments run like this. My education has empowered me to do whatever, or by the grace of Jesus Christ, I can do X. It is the power given to us, the empowering, the freedom that we pick up. Throughout this thing, again, I will be talking mostly about religious liberty. Religious liberty is an immunity, not an empowerment, and it is an immunity in a specialized context. It is an immunity from anything that can have serious coercive power over me. I am immune from that. That would be from state interference in forcing me to say that I believe something that I don't, or forcing me to not say something that I indeed do believe. It is a civic right. The Vatican decree concerns the immunity right concerning what I do or can't do in public. Towards the end of the talk, I will mention religious liberty as an empowerment, but everything that I'm going to say before we get to the end is really dealing with immunity in the face of state or severe economic deprivation. Now, second preliminary content, something that I should say, John Courtney Murray, S.J., was somebody I never met. But in graduate school, I was forced into studying him a bit. And as mentioned, I noticed some Lonergan connections and became rather interested in him. The link between systematic theology and social ethics. He was a New York Jesuit, taught at Woodstock College for many, many years. In 1954, he was silenced on his discussion of church arguments for or against religious liberty by a fellow by the name of Octaviani, who was a head of the Holy Inquisition, Holy Office for the Doctrine and Faith, which it eventually became. He was silenced by Ottaviani, and then in 1962, Ottaviani disinvited him from coming as a peritus to the council. In 1963, at Spellman's insistence, he was brought into the second session of the council and eventually became the first scribe, as he himself called it, of the Declaration on Religious Freedom. And I've also included on a little page that I handed out a bit of a chart. I'm going to, if I could get this to work, I'm going to have us listen to, and this will be an introduction to what I have to say about Dignitatis Humanae, to Murray himself. Between the third and the fourth sessions, Murray gave a talk to Georgetown University. On the chart, you can see the third session. During that session, he wrote 3 different drafts for the thing. Ottaviani, again, delayed the vote on the particular document. He is talking in the context of waiting for the fourth session. The rest of the chart we will fill out as we go along. Now, between the third and the fourth sessions of the Second Vatican Council, Murray had the following to say about the draft of what eventually became the Conciliar Declaration on Religious Liberty, more specifically, the fourth draft of which Murray was the first scribe. And here's hoping.
Formation of their inner conscience, the making of their personal religious decisions.
He's talking about the decree that, or the version he wrote.
Part of government in the public exercise of religion. Then, it points out that religious freedom today is not based on or certainly not necessarily based on any irreligious ideology, as was the case in the 19th century. And that introduces an historical question. Oh, this historical question. I wrote it 5 different times, and it's still no good. It was criticized, and quite rightly criticized, because it's too narrow. It undertakes to make only one point, namely, you have the fact that Pius IX, exactly 100 years before Passion and Terrace, said exactly the opposite about to what John the 23rd said. Pius IX, quoting Gregory the 16th, said that religious freedom is a nightmare, what is deliramentum, such a fantasy as might overcome a man in the middle of the night, an illusion. John the 23rd, exactly 100 years later, says that religious freedom is a natural right of man. The man has a natural right to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Well, this raises a neat little problem in the development of doctrine. How do you get two popes who say exactly the opposite thing to be really saying the same thing? Well, this is what we have theologians for.
And it got some of us to be theologians. So in what follows, I lay out how theologians have tried to bridge the gap between Pius IX and John the 23rd, both during the council, that is, how religious liberty was justified in Dignitatis, and how theologians and others today attempt to bridge the gap, including how religious, that is, including religious liberty as it is currently received. I begin with Murray because of his humor, for his close involvement in the formation of Dignitatis, and is the best starting point I know to tease out the not very clear current understandings of what the argument was about in 1964 and what is now at stake in our current call for religious liberty. At that November conference at Georgetown University, Murray and others confidently predicted that his 4th draft would be victorious during the 4th conciliar session. We will find, however, that that confidence was misplaced, that confusion within the document has led to an uneven reception of the document's nonetheless solid judgment that religious liberty is a moral and perhaps religious good. This confusion or ambiguity spills over into how currently we Roman Catholics understand and deal with social, political order issues in our various political bodies, such as the United States, within our global societies and society, and importantly, within our own church itself. I first will trace through Murray's understanding of 3 attempts by the pre-conciliar and conciliar church to bridge the gap, to understand why and justify how Roman Catholic teaching on this issue could change. Secondly, I will appeal to a guy named John O'Malley as he reinterprets that just about 2 years ago. In O'Malley, we get the current state-of-the-art description on how all 16 conciliar documents are now received, including Dignitatis. In the 3rd section of my talk, I will try and tease out a 4th distinct understanding of how to bridge the gap, which O'Malley's classification obscures, a 4th type of argument that is actually at play in all 3 of the Council's externally directed documents, in Dignitatis, in Nostra aetate, the decree on Christian relations to non-Christian religions, and Gaudium et spes, the church in the modern world. This is where the strongest most stringent battles of the Vatican Council debates were fought. It is about this and the issues involved that we are dealing in a very special sense with issues that we are beginning to face nowadays. A lot of my own reflections of these issues come out of working at Georgetown University, where we have a multi-religion or interfaith doctoral program, where Protestants, Muslims, and so on, and Christians and Catholics have to talk to one another in ways that we've never had to before. Finally, I will close with a brief description of recent American Episcopal claims for public moral voice as grounded in the right to practice their religious liberty. During our most recent presidential campaign season, several American bishops cried foul on the United States government attempts to control governmental funding for Catholic social services, to tie it to several morally troubling areas involving gender, sexual orientation, birth control, and pre-birth human life. Their claims generated, at least briefly, some public interest, if not light. Curiously, however, the more remarkable condemnations of the bishop's appeals were voiced by Roman Catholic ultra-conservatives, particularly an ex-Jesuit, David Schindler, for whom the very notion of a human right, any human right, including civil religious freedom, betrays a capitulation and a participation in atheistic enlightenment, an assault on the freedoms that we are given in Christ Jesus. I will mention these current, even uneven appeals to religious liberty at the conclusion of what I have to say. So on the back page of your sheets are more or less the four areas that I will talk about. The first is the justifications of religious freedom in the mid-1960s, that is, during and immediately after the Council. 50 years ago at the Council, how were theologians trying to bridge the gap between Pius IX and John XXIII? By Murray's own relating, there were three key arguments. The first argument was that Pacem in Terrace's affirmation of religious liberty, with its separation of church and state and non-establishment of any religion, was simply a settling for a lesser of two evils. Allowing free expression of heretical voices was considered an evil, but less bad than, say, a full-blown civil war. This position held that we have to settle for religious liberty itself, although that settling is not itself evil, but the institution itself certainly and always is evil, against God's will and hopes for civil and religious social unanimity. We are to make do with what is possible. Now, this was the closest Catholic magisterium came to endorsing religious freedom. The magisterium, as some of you might remember, up until Vatican II, insisted that we Catholics were obliged, if possible, to suppress public heterodox voices, but that where we lacked political power, we could, for the sake of public peace and our own safety, settle for religious tolerance. This, of course, made Protestants and atheists nervous, especially given the high Catholic birth rates in those days. However, by Murray's count, there were, at the time of the Council, two further arguments that coherently called for the magisterial affirmation of religious liberty, and that looked on religious liberty as an intrinsic good. The first alternative was Murray's own argument, for which in 1954 he had been silenced, but then developed further after his public voice was restored in 1963. By my count, by 1964, Murray had run 8 or so distinct arguments for religious liberty, some of which collapsed in his hands. By 1964 at the council, he had an argument that was joined by Italians and Anglos, some Germans, most Eastern Europeans, most Orientals, not too many South Americans, and by some Eastern Europeans again. 3 characteristics of this affirmation of religious liberty concern us here. First, Murray argued that the institution of civil religious liberty is a social good, not an evil, as demonstration, if you want a demonstration, of how the church thrives in places where governments have no say in religious matters. Secondly, this social good civic institution developed first outside the church, to which the church must now be attentive. That argument for some Catholics of the outside birth of religious liberty was hard to swallow. Third, the international global affirmation of religious liberty expressed, as Parliamentaris affirmed, a development in the moral aspirations, the rising will of peoples and nations. Parliamentaris understood religious liberty to be an aspect of human dignity, involving social agency and social transparency, about which I will talk more in the 3rd section. And finally, according to Murray, there was again a 3rd argument that was a second alternative to the lesser of two evils argument, a defense that was represented mostly by French and Belgians who had little sympathy for the Anglo-American roots that Murray claimed for religious liberty. This argument, as did Murray's, judged that civic religious liberty is a moral and perhaps a religious good, but found the roots of that good in early Christian sources, not, as did Murray, in a convergence of religious and secular arguments expressed or revealed in the sign of our own times. A key difference between Murray's and the French argument was that Murray found the specific good of civil religious liberty revealed first outside the church. The French found it first inside the earliest church. Which of these 3 justifications is dominant in Dignitatis, and what is the relationship between the 3? It appears that the 3rd argument, the attempt to found religious liberty on the earliest Christian sources, was Dignitatis' primary argument, in that the inclusion of the other arguments, others, including Murray's, were last-minute additions to an essentially French text. The 3rd and 4th drafts, both Murray's, received negative votes in the range of the mid-200s out of around 2,300 votes, scandalously high for a near-final document emerging from the council. With Pope Paul VI going to the United Nations to talk of peace, the relatively high negative votes were judged to be politically and morally intolerable. And then fate intervened. After Murray's text was received by the council, apparently open to only minor revisions, Murray suffered a collapsed lung, which took him out of the penultimate revisions. While he was sidelined, the received version, again that was not supposed to be revised, was substantially rewritten by the French and Belgian bishops. Their rewriting attempted to ground religious liberty dominantly in Christian scriptures and the church fathers. Finally, phrases and particular arguments from both the lesser of two evils argument and from Murray's historical and juridical arguments were reintroduced into the text for the sake of bringing both conservatives and the Anglo-American Italian Germans back into the tent, leaving the final vote with only 70 negative votes, still uncomfortably high for a final conciliar doctrine. I think Nostra aetate was the only other document to receive more negative votes. So what does one find when one receives, that is, takes in what is affirmed in Dignitatis? Almost anything and everything. Wherever one sees the insistence that we must search for the truth and adhere to the truth when found, one is dealing with the argument that for centuries had allowed Catholics to coexist with religious liberty as the lesser of two evils, and to coerce, of course, when opportune. On the other hand, wherever one finds juridical notions, particularly the principle as much freedom as possible, as much coercion as necessary, or theological notions admitting that the church as an institution has sinned by coercively restraining public adherence to or expression of heterodox religious proclamations, one is encountering Murray's own justification for religious liberty as an historically emergent moral and religious good. And when one finds attempts to found religious liberty in Scripture, or the suggestion that the early church actually favored religious liberty, we are reading primarily the French argument. None of these three arguments are linked together in the final declaration. Their mutual contraries and contradictions remain unaddressed. The French argument dominates mostly by weight, quantity, and its ability to highlight the best of then current Roman Catholic political intentions. When I was first studying Murray 30-some years ago, I was puzzled by his fourth period and post-conciliar claims that what we must affirm in as magisterial in Dignitatis is the affirmative judgment of the goodness or correctness of religious liberty, not any of the arguments that it offers for that. It appeared to me that Murray was trying to deny his own baby. However, in actuality, the final document was not his baby. It was mostly French lineage with contradictory arguments thrown in for the sake of votes, which was a good thing to get, not necessarily for clarity or for new insight. And so, 2013, current understandings of our three justifications. The current widely accepted description of what went on at Vatican II is at least a niece of Murray's three-part understanding. This description has emerged from the University of Bologna with its intricate historical work and within the writings of John O'Malley, a Jesuit colleague of mine at Georgetown University. According to O'Malley, there are again three major ways that theologians try to bridge the gap between Pius IX's condemnation of civil religious liberty and John XXIII's affirmation. Each of these three approaches comes in a weak and a strong form. The first understanding is that this bridging is spun by John XXIII's call for adjournamento. The weakest of its forms allows that at times we must live with evil institutions, such as unrestrained public expression of heretical voice. We must and morally can adapt. Stronger forms of adjournamento in the adjournamento line, on the other hand, allow that there are goods that have developed outside the church to which the church ought to pay attention. Here we have a range of possible goods, from material to technological to cultural to moral, and or to religious. This understanding of aggiornamento becomes stronger as one includes more of those external emergent goods, moving from the material to the religious. It is not surprising, of course, that most religious people allow that some material or cultural goods emerge from outside their religion, while they hesitate to allow that any earth-shaking moral or religious good emerges from the outside. No goods that are not discoverable or rediscoverable within their own religious foundations and traditions. Most of us are moderately aggiornamentoists. There are, however, stronger forms of aggiornamento that are more willing to notice even novel religious goods emerging outside our immediate religious communion. According to O'Malley, however, the possibility of aggiornamento in its strongest form did not appear at Vatican II. On this point, I disagree. It seems to me that in the debates over Dignitatis, again, Nostra aetate et Gaudium et spes, they were arguing about whether or not we could learn religious good things from outside our particular tradition and our particular church. A second theological attempt to bridge the moral and doctrinal gaps is the notion of development. For O'Malley and others, the paradigm example of a conservative, strong notion of doctrinal development is Mariology, as particularly brought to specification in the doctrines of the 19th century definition of the Assumption and the 20th century definition of the Immaculate Conception. Here, development is thought to be cumulative and increasingly more specific. Vatican I's affirmation of papal infallibility is also thought to be a development and a specification in its centralizing thrust, from which we cannot back away. Weaker forms of developmental theory would allow the emergence of novel, if secondary and non-threatening qualifications of what went on before. Here, that which is new can take shape beyond the tradition's beginnings, but still within the tradition, a truth or good that is not found in the founding religious experience, but certainly not contradictory to that initial inspiration. O'Malley's final theological means for bridging the gap in Catholic teaching is ressourcement, the return from later historical accretions and distortions to the original pure, allegedly pure source of one's faith, sources primarily to be found in scriptures and the fathers of the church. Here it is recognized that some developments in church teaching, even in faith and morals, can be time-limited, incorrect, and perhaps even evil in the strongest versions of this theory. Here the concern is with reform in the sense of purifying the teaching and the life of the church. In its strongest and most common form, the truth of what constitutes followers of Christ is thought to contain in those early resources everything that is salvific, all that we seem to know, even if inchoately. Which of these ways to bridge the gap are most reformative of the church as a people and as an institution? It is O'Malley's firm contention that the ressourcement model offers the most coherent explanation of theological and moral reformation at Vatican II, including the reforming elements of Dignitatis. The problem is, however, that none of O'Malley's three models captures what was going forward and most neuralgic with Dignitatis, nor with Nostra aetate, nor with substantial sections of Gaudium et spes, at least that which is and can be most reformative of the church's understanding and practice. Earlier, I mentioned that there are 3 or 8 distinct arguments of John Courtney Murray for religious freedom. What I would like to do here now is to just outline 2 of the stages to get at something that it seems to me is being currently missed in our attempts to justify what religious freedom is and in receiving the document. The first of Murray's arguments that got him silenced in 1954. After abandoning the lesser of two evils argument, Murray turned towards juridical theory and then juridical history, eventually asserting what he considered a natural law argument in defense of an Anglo-American separation of church, state, and importantly, society, with a special emphasis on society. But it was a different natural law from the one that he inherited. By 1954, he was claiming that particularly the Anglo-American tradition allowed for significant development of principles, not simply a development of applications. Most importantly, that tradition, he claimed, was based on a great act of faith in the moral agency of the people, and behind that was more deeply grounded in the Thomistic claim that the justice of the king is to be authenticated not by the king, nor by the elites, not by scholars, nor by the church. The liberal tradition of the West recognized the moral agency of people as the forum, source, and adjudicators of governmental justice, eventually bringing such claims to constitutional expression. This, Murray claimed with fragile appeal to Pius XII, was a new moral insight, internationally emergent in reaction to early 20th century fascism and communism, an insight that represented a new will of the God of nature. And this new will of nature's God laid inescapable claim, moral and religious demands on religious believers, including Roman Catholics, claims that were unavailable to the early church and therefore not derivable or deducible from the early church. Some charged that Murray was silenced mostly for his arrogance or because of Romans' ignorance. But in truth, Ottaviani and other conservative Catholics well understood that Murray was making an ecclesially uncomfortable claim, the claim that God can speak a new truth to believers out of the mouths of a heretical or atheistic ass. He was challenging dominant ecclesiastical understandings of contemporary resources of revealed insight, claiming that at least some of our salvation has newly become available from outside the church. Such a claim moves well beyond the ressourcement model of how correct redemptive insight will and can make claims on Catholics. As will be mentioned below, such claims challenge many standard notions of how and to whom God is capable of really revealing God's self to human beings. In 1964, Murray gave his argument an increasingly historical depth. Beyond the state and beyond the institution now stand the people, in one of his favorite phrases, permanently locked together in moral and religious argument. It was an ongoing action, a verb, a public good. It was related to but distinct from other public goods, much less private goods that we pursue. It is the common good of Catholic social thought. But what does being locked together in argument look like? Here, probably the simplest way of outlining the social moral agency is is to mention a few twists that Murray himself had to undergo. Again, throughout his life, good soldier that he was, he adopted just about every conservative Catholic argument he could find until they disintegrated in his hands. For example, for most of his life, he claimed that redemptive God talk, that is, talking theology with Protestants, was an impossibility between Catholics and other Christians, that we must restrict our ecumenical conversation to nature and nature's God, stay within natural law. But then, after the council, Murray argued Bernard Lonergan's notion of Trinitarian doctrine with Lutherans and issues of ecclesial discipline, liberty, and freedom with Anglicans. Again, for all but the last 4 years of his life, he insisted that no Christian could deal with communists except by way of force, of realpolitik. There did not exist, he judged, any common ground between Marxists and Christians, neither nature nor nature's God. We can deal with them only in terms of raw physical survival. But then after the council, albeit with a bit of twisting and screaming, he began to talk about our mutual gnosis, knowledge, and agnosis, ignorance of God, with Marxists and with atheist existentialists. I have a little quote from that area, the last one on the page that you have. Being locked together in the difficult twists of transparent conversation became the public good that Murray himself had to live out of his own religious faith, as suggested or revealed by the sign of his own times. And he expected the church to learn and practice those transparent but terribly difficult public value discussions that larger scale social living, ecclesial, and civic newly demands of us. At issue is a set of virtues that we are only now beginning to understand. Virtues, however, that Murray was forced to practice a bit earlier in his life. It was in a public discussion of how religion ought to be enter into public education. Murray, who had earlier claimed that we had best not talk about revealed foundations of our Catholic faith, now argued that all faiths should be taught in the public schools, preferably by believers. He was not asking for proselytization. He wanted students to be able to notice the link between core commitments of faith and the faith community and that community's policy recommendations. For example, if we Catholics claim to support religious liberty, we are under obligation to demonstrate how that support is anchored into our deepest faith commitments. And Protestants have a right to know how those commitments are so linked. Why are we obliged? For the sake of public trust. If I can't demonstrate such a link, then those outside my religious community will have to live with the possibility, as well as will I, that there might come a time when I must coercively suppress their public voice. Integrity demands transparency. Transparency can encourage integrity. Our commitment to moral agency of the people demands a free commitment to be locked together and to stay permanently in the public argument. It is this set of virtues that I think is behind, especially one of the behind the issues that O'Malley identifies as core to Vatican II as a social language event. These issues are the background music that O'Malley talks about, are the background music often overlooked and insufficiently understood mega issues that permeate each and every one of our 16 topic-specific resulting documents. In O'Malley's telling, there are 3 issues or trajectories. These 3 issues are the historical nature of church teaching, secondly, concern with the relationship of the center and periphery. At the council, it was the center and the bishops. Now it is the center and the marginal and or the laity. And the third, O'Malley calls a question of style. It is the last of these, the style conciliar interactions, that best approaches that for which Murray was arguing, the emergence of a genuinely new arena of ethical living with its own norms and virtues analogous to other sorts of realms. At first reading, Murray's dynamic public transparency or O'Malley's style can appear simply as an interpersonal nicety added to the frosting of our ethical and religious cake, or a bit of human kindness, or even maybe the interpersonal kindness of Jesus, smoothing slightly the sharp edges of our society. However, if Murray is right, the source of this transparent argument or style are internal to large-scale social living, not external additions. It is a core requirement for the moral functioning of that living in large-scale human reality. It is demanded by nature and nature's God. So finally, it is here that Murray's claim and our present ecclesial reality have become difficult and challenging. Integrity and honesty demand that we admit that we are a religious community. We as a religious community are not currently locked together in argument concerning many moral and religious and theological issues, neither internally nor externally. We sometimes do proclaim, but we don't argue. Proclamation is not argument. Raw public assertion does not fulfill the requirements for a society locked together in argument. If there is, as Murray insisted, this modern realm of ethical action that from the outside places legitimate demand and God-filled demands on us, then the current church appears to be immoral in 2 specific regards. By not allowing internal church argument on a full scale, full range of theological and ethical topics, the church is demonstrating to those outside the church, but with people with whom we must live, that we choose not to operate by the norms that, again, the modern and postmodern worlds are discovering as necessary for moral operation. And secondly, by engaging in external civic conversations simply by way of proclamation, without exposing or engaging in argument that might support the judgments that we proclaim, we are doing to public conversation, external conversation, what we are doing to our own internal discussions, silencing those potential discussions, even while our voice is often growing louder and shriller. By not living in O'Malley's style or Murray's argument, we can be coherently judged to be socially immoral, to be bent on killing that distinct social good that modernity has revealed. Murray called it a refusal of tribalism. It proclaims that our God is smarter or more loving or more revealing to us than your God. But it demonstrates and lives politically little of what God's wisdom or love or self-giving are about. At their core, the possible manner of understanding the gaps that open up at Vatican II are matters of faith. Is our God capable of giving God's self to us? Capable of revealing something new to us, even from outside our tradition? The revelation we need, like the needs themselves, are new and distinct. They were not available to our founding generations. Murray's final justification for religious liberty, and in this case, religious freedom, was the need for God's active grace in every human construct that our science and our technology propel us into. One final word on the reception of Dignitatis in the United States. It is now a truism that the U.S. Catholic Church has moved from large-scale public debates on peace and nuclear weapons, on the economy, and on the position of women in church and society, to stances of public proclamation on various ethical, religious, and theological issues that forgo the discipline of being locked together in argument. Proclamation actually makes far less demands on religious freedom than does involvement in argument. It requires only an impersonal immunity, not a personal empowerment, not having one's voice silenced. It is then not surprising that our episcopal appeals to the right to religious freedom call upon merely the most individualistic and privatized notions of a human right, as our most vehemently anti-Western Catholics insist. It ought to strike believers who have stood strongly against Western individualism and the privatization of religion as something of a tragedy that we can do no better. But again, to do better would be to take risks that there is more to be revealed, and that there is a God capable of now participating in that revealing and in our mutual reform. So my comments on Dignitatis, again, much of this I think is born out of my experience of interfaith conversation at Georgetown University, where after a while it becomes obvious that the truth that is to bind us eventually together is something that will come to us from the future and not particularly from any of our pasts. So thank you.
Ethics at Boston College. And were you working with David
Hollenbach, yes.
David Hollenbach there?
Leon's advisor as well.
His scholarship focuses on issues of ethics, freedom, and democratic values. And he's published all over the place, including several articles in Theological Studies, America, some of you may have read his stuff there, and the National Catholic Reporter. I'm only touching on the surface here of things that you might be familiar with. So David is going to lead us, and then he's going to be followed by David Kennedy, who is the Donald McLaughlin Professor of History Emeritus. His 1970 book, Birth Control in America, The Career of Margaret Sanger, embraced the medical, legal, political, and religious dimensions of the subject and helped to pioneer the emerging field of women's history. Over here, the First World War in American Society, 1980, used the history of American involvement in World War I to analyze the American political system, economy, and culture in the early 20th century. And Freedom from Fear, the American People in Depression and War, recounts the history of the United States and the two great crises of the Great Depression and World War II. So he's going to be addressing this from the standpoint of being an historian. I might add that he was one of my professors when I was an undergraduate, so it's nice to be able to call upon you. All right, so let's start out with David.
Thank you.
I wanted to start out just by reading from the Declaration on Religious Freedom in Vatican II what really is, in a sense, the core affirmation or basis of the right. So this is why, in a sense, there is a right to religious freedom in Catholic thought. It is in accordance with their dignity as persons, that is, beings endowed with reason and free will, and therefore privileged to bear personal responsibility, that all should be at once impelled by nature and also bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth, especially religious truth. I note that because I very much appreciated Professor Hooper's paper, but I think he didn't give quite enough credit to the success John Courtney Murray had in sort of establishing what, to my mind, is really the core argument of the Declaration for Religious Freedom that, in fact, justifies religious liberty throughout the Catholic Church. And that's really that argument. And my brief remarks here are really made because I think, to my mind, just as there was resistance at the time of the Vatican Council to the arguments put forward by John Courtney Murray, like that argument there, so today I think there is similar resistance to this particular justification for the right to religious freedom, resistance within the Catholic Church to articulating the right of religious freedom as based on what is actually in the Declaration here. So I'd like to just make these arguments in a way, in some respects, it's an explanation for Professor Hooper's explanation, is what I'm going to offer here in terms of what I have to say. So, two key points. One is going to be looking at the relationship of truth and freedom, and the other, the church and the spirit. And I'm going to do this in about 4 minutes. So here we go. Of course, the philosophical problem of the relationship of truth and freedom is a wildly complex matter we will not resolve tonight. I only wish to note that the hierarchical magisterium of the Catholic Church has appeared to resolve this matter and has done so with a strong suspicion of freedom in its own right and by subordinating the importance of freedom to truth. John Paul II articulated this approach to the problem when he said, as he often did, that freedom negates and destroys itself when it no longer recognizes and respects its essential link with the truth. Then Cardinal Ratzinger in the mid-1990s amplified this argument with his shockingly sharp criticism of modern freedom. He argued that the radical demand for freedom, which today largely shapes the public mentality, prefers to have neither a whence nor a whither, to be neither from nor for, but to be wholly at liberty. And he added darkly and comprehensively, the implicit goal of all of modernity's struggles for freedom is to be at last like a God who depends on nothing and no one, and whose own freedom is not restricted by that of another. This dismal view of freedom in modernity raises several issues for us this evening. One is just how dismal the view is. Here, I recall the apt criticism by theologian Maureen Juncker-Kenny of Ratzinger's account of freedom, as she said, "Is the finite freedom of human beings not, first of all, to be honored and explicated as willed by God before it is criticized as the vacuous freedom of individuals?" Another concern for us tonight is how such a dismal view of freedom correlates well with the conviction that the moral significance of religious freedom is not found so much in the freedom and responsibility to choose the truth as it is in obedience to the truth. Archbishop Charles Chaput of Philadelphia articulated this view, and in doing so, instrumentalized, in a recent talk, in doing so, instrumentalized the core principle of religious liberty by subordinating it to what he called the deeper freedom that is discipleship in Jesus Christ. He said last summer at a Fortnight for Freedom service, the purpose of religious liberty is to create the context for true freedom. Religious liberty is a foundational right. It's necessary for a good society, but it can never be sufficient for human happiness. It's not an end in itself. In the end, we defend religious liberty in order to live the deeper freedom that is discipleship in Jesus Christ. I note these conceptions of the relationship of truth and freedom because they are both pervasive in the approach to religious freedom in contemporary Catholicism, and because they represent one philosophical option among available others within the Catholic tradition for understanding this relationship. We could find other sources in the Catholic tradition in support of the modern affirmation of religious freedom as it is actually in the document, if we were not wed so much to this singular and largely Augustinian view. I would say go more to Aquinas, or go to the work of contemporary theologian and Cardinal Walter Casper and his ideas of God as all-determining freedom. We could also find such sources if we did not identify the Catholic tradition so much in terms of what has been defined as true by the hierarchical magisterium, and instead considered more closely what has been discovered through the experience of Christian love lived out by the people of God. The historian John Noonan has argued that such an attention to love is the key to understanding the development of moral doctrine. As Noonan put it in an image that applies to the religious freedom discussion, on the surface, contradictions appear. At the deepest level, the course is clear. Yesterday, I celebrated Pentecost at my parish in Santa Cruz in a state of confusion. How, I wondered as Mass proceeded, did the feast of the giving of the Holy Spirit become a day on which priests say, "Happy birthday," to the congregation in order to celebrate the founding of the Church? I'm sure there are important theological considerations at work. In fact, I think I'm aware of them. But I am sure as well that this is a troubling category shift. Pentecost is becoming more about how indispensable the Church is to the Holy Spirit than it is about how indispensable, and I might add, uncontrollable, blowing where'er it will inside and outside the confines of the visible Church, the Spirit is to the Church. I mention this here because I think this category shift illuminates one final interpretive lens by which to consider the problem of continuity which Professor Hooper's paper addresses. If the Spirit really is confined within the visible Church, then there is little reason not to think that the modern doctrine of religious freedom, what the Enlightenment gave to the Church, is indeed a very uneasy fit for Catholic doctrine. But if the Spirit is really boundless, or as Walter Casper puts it, if the Spirit is understood as the free self-communication of God in history, then we have that much more reason to respect others, non-Catholics, our fellow citizens, and to test and explore discoveries outside the visible confines of the Church. Such a declaration of finding, such a searching and finding of these things could never be explained by a seamless line of development. Instead, it would have to be a story of twists and turns filled with saints and sinners locked together in argument. Thank you.
How do you use that or not? That microphone or? Does it matter?
Actually, I think that one will work, David.
Okay.
You have to just speak with your regular voice.
Okay. Well, I would first like to thank my former student, Paul Crowley, for organizing this course and for inviting me to participate in it. But I'd also like to thank Leon Hooper for his splendid paper, and for his stimulating presentation here tonight. And thanks as well to him and to David DeCoste for allowing me to share this platform this evening. I do have a certain sense of completing some sort of life cycle here in this building, which is called Piggott Hall. You can read the history of it out here. I grew up in Seattle. The Piggott family is from Seattle. And in the church that I grew up in, the parish I grew up in, St. Catherine's Parish in north part of Seattle, the Stations of the Cross were dedicated to the church by the Piggott family. So I hadn't figured all that out until this very evening when I read the plaque out here. And as it happens, along with at least one other person in this room, I went to a Jesuit high school in Seattle, and now I find myself on the platform here with 3 Jesuits, and it's a little intimidating when I recollect my boyhood and think of...
Two, but a Jesuit high school graduate also.
Well, as you will understand, I come to this subject this evening not as a theologian or as a specialist in canon law or the fine points of argumentation about church doctrine. I come to it rather as an historian, a word that I've come to understand as having something of a bad odor about it in the context of this discussion. Witness to what we heard on the audio portion, John Courtney Murray's discomfort when confronting what he called an historical question. Oh, that historical question, he said. So it would seem that there is at least one position that a timeless faith and a church out of time need not and perhaps cannot accommodate historical reasoning, by which I mean a thinking process predicated on the notion of change over time and dedicated to considerations of context, indeed ever-altering contexts. As the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus put it some 2,500 years ago, it is impossible to step into the stream of time twice at the same place. And when history takes seriously its definition by another Greek, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, as philosophy teaching by example, history as a way of thinking is also attentive to the lived experience of peoples in the past as a guide to our own experience in the present and as we face our future. So in that regard, I submit that John the 23rd was himself something of an historian, or at least someone who thought with an historian's sensibility. What other sensibility could have used the term aggiornamento to describe the great project that we know as Vatican II? The word literally means deification, that's D-A-Y-ification, or daement, though it's usually more felicitously translated as updating. But however rendered in whatever language, the concept of aggiornamento unmistakably directs our attention to this day, the here and now, and it clearly signals an understanding that today is not yesterday, or any other day for that matter, but it is its own unique moment in time. So with that in mind, I must say that I find the distinction between John Courtney Murray's argument that the sources of religious liberty are to be discovered in modern history, post-Enlightenment history, I guess more specifically, versus what I take to be the French and Belgian and perhaps John O'Malley's argument about ressourcement, that ancient texts actually contain the requisite arguments to valorize religious liberty as a positive social good. It's difficult, frankly, for me to confront that argument without recollecting the old canard that reduced theological disputation to an argument about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. Both are arguments from history about facts rooted in time and documented in text and practice, though they're different moments in time, whether more modern or more ancient, and both arguments take as their objective the reconciliation of different moments in time, seeking guidance for the present in the past, whether near or distant. So let me offer a further reflection on the specifically American past, the subject matter that I'm alleged to know more about than theology, and the American context in which these matters play out for most of us here in this room. And here the foundation for all discussion is the fabled First Amendment, which embraces in its one single sentence freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right of peaceful assembly. All those matters it protects, it should be noted, involve the vitality of civil society and the protection of civil society against the arbitrary authority of the state. That amendment, and let it be noted, it has pride of place as the very first amendment, is a monument to the founders' faith in the people and their concern to preserve and enhance the energies that a free society could generate. More specifically, when it referred to religion, the First Amendment had two things to say. First, that there should be no established church, and secondly, that the state could not prohibit the free exercise of religion, commonly referred to as the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Both of those clauses have been hugely dispositive in giving us the religious landscape that we inhabit. Between them, they have helped make this country among the most religious in the Western world. And of course, they have also created the context over more than 2 centuries in which the Catholic Church, always a minority, though an increasingly large minority over time, has flourished on American soil. Now, no less an authority than John Courtney Murray himself correctly noted in a pair of essays in the late 40s and early 50s the dramatic difference between the two different state approaches to religion. French anti-clerical legislation dating back to the Revolution of 1789 and continuing to our own time, and the United States Constitution's First Amendment, brought forward in the same year of 1789, ratified in 1791. The first, the French tradition, repressed one religion in particular, Roman Catholicism. The other, the First Amendment, hugely galvanized religious sentiment and led to a proliferation of religious institutions. So to this day, that religiosity in our society and that densely populated churchly landscape are salient and abiding characteristics, distinguishing characteristics, really, of American life. It has, in fact, become a truism, a pillar of the conventional wisdom, that the founders' creation, in effect, of a free market for religion is precisely what has energized, motivated, and sustained religion and religious bodies in the United States, just as free market in the realm of the economy has stimulated so much entrepreneurial and other energy. Most of us, I think, probably regard that development as a positive social good. And let's recollect that it is one rooted in specific historical circumstances in the late 18th century, and that it has its own long record of historical praxis and evolution. Now, not without reason did generations of majority Protestants in this country, rightly understanding the Orthodox Roman Catholic doctrine that error has no rights, wring their proverbial knickers about the prospect of what might happen if and when a Catholic majority ever emerged and came to power. That was, after all, the great anxiety that John F. Kennedy was obliged to address squarely in his address to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association on September 12, 1960. Almost 24 years to the day later, on September 13, 1984, New York Governor Mario Cuomo was obligated to revisit that same question about the separation of church and state and Catholic attitudes toward state policy in his notable speech at Notre Dame, as I say, just about 24 years to the day later. So here we are confronting this question, and maybe it would be good to reflect on why it is that Catholic leaders in this plural democracy still feel obliged to lay to rest their countrymen's fears that Catholics are not reliable citizens in a world that honors individual conscience and prides itself on its own hard-won achievement of underwriting social peace by tolerating dissent, indeed tolerating differences of many kinds, racial, ethnic, and sexual, as well as religious. Would we truly care to live in a world that repudiated all that? What would John XXIII, the author of Pacem in Terris, say to that? I think he would say, no, dona nobis pacem.
Leon, if you'd like to respond, you may, or we can open it up to questions immediately.
Just one thing, David, you threw me a little bit by seeking the truth as being the core of the thing. It is one of the 3 cores of the thing, at least in my reading of it anyway. Murray has a beautiful thing in something that he wrote for Theological Studies in TS in about 55, somewhere around in there, that I will grant that you ought to seek the truth, but of course I know the truth. and I'm going to help you get to the truth. As soon as you begin to worry about what norms we use, you've got two directions to go. You could go to somebody that has just raw power to enforce the truth, or you could go out to public argument. In most of our ethical lives, we have interpersonal affections can bind us together, as well as the rational arguments that we have, as well as the very intimacies that we have living with one another. In the social arena, we've got two possibilities: raw power or public conversation. As soon as you get into public conversation, then I would ask myself, is there something new to these public conversations and moral demands that are new to us now? And, Murray himself was silenced on this particular issue, but as you know, wrote on about religious freedom, particularly in American context. A lot of the stuff that we have to deal with nowadays is whether or not there are continuities or discontinuities. I don't think you were saying that we could go back and just find it in the historical record, but there might be some new things out there, and you did mention the American.
So let's hear from some of the students. Any questions that you may like to pose? Yes, Bill.
How did John the 23rd handle the gap?
By laughing, I think. I actually did read some things on the formation of Pacem in Terris and went into that. And he apparently did realize that he was doing some radical things in that, setting the tone for certainly Nostra aetate and Gaudium et spes as well, in discussing the rising will of, that was emerging, that he credited as good, as distinct from what was emerging in the church itself, and opening the windows to that. So I don't.
Something that came up in this recent presidential cycle is that both vice presidential nominees were both Catholic.
Yeah.
I remember at the end of one of the debates is how do you reconcile, your Catholic background with two things that the U.S. Council of Bishops that came out against. With one, some of the bishops criticized Paul Ryan's economic teachings that's not consistent, and then Joe Biden's pro-choice background.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you comment on this and the kind of as kind of trying to find a role in this political discourse that's kind of been occurring across, moving forward as more kind of, I guess John F. Kennedy you point to as first Catholic president, but moving forward, kind of the role, the relationship between these Catholic politicians.
How to get it to move forward? Or was it how to get the thing to move forward?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's just
Do you guys want to do that?
Well, I have a thought. I'm not sure it's wholly responsive to your question.
Oh, no, there's
But
more of a comment.
it's in the arena of your question, but it may not be a satisfactory answer. But I've been heard to say, and so others, that John F. Kennedy was the first Catholic president and the last Catholic president, in the sense that Catholicism has no longer had the valence that it once did in the political arena, and is now not remarkable that, as you just pointed out, two people on the presidential tickets in the last round were Catholic, and that just went unremarked. And for that matter, it's also worth noting in this context that Mitt Romney's Mormonism never became much of an issue either. So you think on the one hand, maybe what that suggests is that our society has evolved to a place where we become very tolerant of religious diversity, and we just don't make a point of that any longer. But where I think, if I understand what underlay your question a bit, where you're headed is that to the extent that the church starts asserting itself doctrinally and dogmatically and inflexibly on a lot of very divisive social issues, maybe the original formulation that John F. Kennedy was the last Catholic president in a literal sense will become true.
Well, I was just, I was thinking that,
I wonder, if I think ideally where the future might go on this, I do think at some point, perhaps in light of Professor Kennedy's remark, there has to be some backing away, or there has to be, to my mind, a diminishment in the kind of specificity with which the bishops are weighing in on all sorts of things. And I don't think that would be bad, and I actually don't think that would necessarily diminish a Catholic influence in public life. What it might open up are different modes of moral reasoning open to Catholic legislators and politicians they could bring to bear on the things they're dealing with. It may not reflect the kind of unanimity that there appears to be a desire to have, but I'm not sure that unanimity, when you get down to the degree of specifics of these policy issues, is really something that should be aimed for anyhow. I don't know that it's actually really possible and even something that we should desire.
Just a slight comment on, just like kind of based on that. Another one that just came to mind was, and I'm from Minnesota initially. Recently, there was a gay marriage law that passed on gay marriage, but just previous to the election cycle, there's actually a constitutional amendment to say that marriage was between a man and a woman. And Bishop Neinstedt, who's the current bishop in Twin Cities, ordered all of his parish priests in their homily to say that the church bishop's stance in that you were going to vote as good Catholics, you will vote in X direction, which became pretty controversial in the area. Which it's just, that was just a small little.
Do you recall the resulting vote?
So
He lost.
So they lost. So yeah, gay marriage is now allowed in Minnesota.
Yeah.
And the constitutional amendment, which the bill had been pulled on.
It's becoming almost to the point that Catholic bishops, on almost everything they've been trying to sign off on, have been losing particularly. Yeah.
Mary Margaret?
Yeah, and I just think that what's so sad about that is thinking Catholics are leaving the church and finding truth in other religious traditions that honor their human dignity, even though we have this document that says the Catholic Church honors our human dignity. So, I think that's true.
Let me make a case for on a divisive issue, abortion particularly, and the ways that we might possibly help. And one of the things is to look at what is actually going on out there. And most of the studies that I've seen, I've been looking at this stuff since I forget. It was a book on abortion in 1967 by a Catholic, and I can't remember the name. But
John Noonan. John Noonan.
No, not Noonan.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Yes.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. Where was I going with that? That most, if you look at the statistics, you've got 15% that think that we ought to have a law against abortion at every phase and development along this way. At the other end, you have 15% that would break the spine of whatever came out of the womb if it came out early and all of that sort of stuff. Between that, you've got 70% of the people that seem to recognize that there is something of value here. Mostly they think it is of developmental value, that what we have at 2 weeks is not the same as at 5 weeks. They realize also that civil law is a bad instrument for trying to govern something of a sliding value system. What I find our church doing is unfortunately sticking with one of those polarized debates where they don't then have to argue with the central 70%, and they don't have to justify their particular claims. We can proclaim that full rights holders begin at impregnation, and then we don't have to discuss anything after that. But for us to recognize the debate that is actually out there and try and engage in that debate, it requires considerably more of us than what we're doing right now. But it might try and encourage some sort of allowing people at various stages to say, hey, at this point on, no.
But it strikes me that there have to be habits of argument within the church itself, or conversation, and the ability to have these conversations. If we can even begin to hope to have conversations with, wider publics. And someone's mention of the attempt to go in that direction about 25 or so years ago with pastorals on the economy and on nuclear disarmament and so forth. We're shining moments in that direction. Unfortunately, that's not happening anymore. A lot of other instruments that were suggested by the council itself to encourage that, such as diocesan synods and so forth, are not happening either. But it's not as though we have to reinvent the wheel. We do have the conditions for the possibility there. We've already tried it. It's just simply a matter of willing to do it. But we can't hope to reach people in the culture, I think, unless we begin to practice that kind of civic discourse, if you will, within the church itself.
But, I think it's within the spirit, or consistent with the spirit of Vatican II, to say that what we need to do is go congregational. By which I mean honor the experience, the lived experience of the faithful. And there's an essay which I'm a little bit surprised hasn't already emerged in this discussion. You will know a lot better than I do, by John Henry Newman in 1859 on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine.
That's the title.
That's what he talks about is what I was trying to get at by talking about lived experience, the holistic record of the past as a guide to the present, not just the history of formally articulated doctrine. I think what a lot of people thought was going to happen as a result of Vatican II was much more inclusion of the laity and the church faithful in general in the process of determining doctrine. And I think that hasn't really happened very much. And if I could tell a little story about that, maybe it'd be familiar to many of you if you've ever read a wonderful book by J. Anthony Lucas called Common Ground, which is a detailed history of the school integration crisis in Boston in the early 1970s. Absolutely fabulous book, won every award imaginable, and deserved them all. And at the core of the story is a lot of the white parents in Boston public schools got themselves seriously in the road resisting school integration, and most of them were Catholic. And the church hierarchy, the bishop, there were two different bishops involved over time, tried to persuade their parishioners and the faithful that the right thing to do was to get down with integration, accept it, and this was what human dignity required, and so on and so forth. You all know the arguments. And the laity, the faithful, paid them no heed. And among other things, they paid them no heed, at least so Lucas argues the case, because the faithful had long since lost their faith in the church's credibility over the issue of contraception. They all practiced it. They were very reluctant to believe that they were living in a chronic state of damnation and sin, and they had discounted the church's teaching on that thing, and that spilled over into other domains as well. And the church found itself much less persuasive because it hadn't honored the lived experience of the faithful.
One other thing that strikes me too is we're talking about the Second Vatican Council, where religious freedom is affirmed by the Catholic Church for the first time. It's also striking that it's really only at the Second Vatican Council that democracy is formally, doctrinally affirmed by the Church as well. So obviously the Church's experience with it was much more extensive, but I still think that the kind of late recognition formally of the value of democracy by Catholicism is indicative of some of the problems and jostling we have now. I think whether it's the point that Professor Kennedy made about sort of a familiarity and comfort with the integration of democratic procedures more fully into the church, or externally speaking, whether it's a sort of familiarity, a comfort, a sense of the democratic context not being so threatening to the church externally, the church and the world. And I still think there's a lot of sort of learning that's going on about things like democratic freedom, or even about the natures of laws, gay marriage. I mean, I don't know how many times, it's a civil marriage issue. It is not a theological issue, but I mean, you could talk to your blue in the face about that, and it would not change anyone's minds, because I think there's some sense in which it's almost difficult to imagine a kind of polity that exists sort of outside, I don't know, these different comments. And I think another issue there, and one I think John Courtney Murray could be very helpfully mined even more on, is a reflection on the nature of civil law more deeply within the church. I think now someone like John Paul would argue, very much did argue, civil law ought to reflect as much as possible the moral law. Well, if you put it in that way, I think what you end up doing is sort of diminishing the significance and the purpose of what civil law actually is meant to do. It's not always meant to really reflect as much as possible the moral law. It has a more internal moral imperative of jurisprudence, of organizing political society. And I think we're losing sight of some of those normative imperatives attached to the nature of civil law. I think those are movements, directions I'd love to see the church move more fully into.
Yes.
I'd love to hope that the church is becoming more democratic. I don't have a sense that there's an understanding of the concept of democracy and the way our church is organized. So this is to comment. My question, and I'm looking for ways to be congregational. Would you guys comment on Voice of the Faithful, call to action, and any other opportunities? Because it's very difficult as a person in the pew to find a focus for having a voice.
I don't know. I think they're. I don't know, and I think that they're extremely significant organizations within the church. It does seem that. Certainly reflective of this movement at the Second Vatican Council and the movement of people like Cardinal Newman in his writing of really paying attention to the voice of the laity in the church. I don't know that I have much more to add other than I value them highly and I'd love to see them be more successful, but it's sort of I think someone said, a wintry time in the church in terms of movements like that.
I was at the opening meeting of Voice of the Faithful in Boston. I happened to be teaching there at the time. And what really struck me, it was in Hines Convention Center, and what really struck me was that almost everybody there was north of 50 probably, And that's I'm north of 50 too, so I'm not, I don't want to make that sound ageist, let's put it that way. But I'm also teaching a generation who simply have a very different set of questions and relationship to the church, to power, to authority, and all of that, for the most part. Not, hard to generalize, but it's a good deal of it. And I think that even though all of this stuff was going on in Boston, you see, the Voice of the Faithful was founded in the wake of the sex abuse, the height of the sex abuse scandal stuff in Boston. It was a horrible time to be there, believe me. And so there's a great deal of energy there behind it, and it was good energy. I mean, it was these are good people, right? And I think part of the discourse, the conversation we need to have within the church has to be intergenerational, because quite frankly, people my age are often fighting battles that, for a lot of people, don't exist. And so to some degree, we have to, a great degree, I think, we have to listen to the upcoming generations, who I think give me a lot of hope in terms of imagining new ways of being church. I think that there's much more conversation going on among themselves. I think they're developing habits of consultation. I think they're expecting much more of that. So that would be part of my answer to this question. I I don't place a great amount of hope in those particular kinds of movements, to be perfectly honest. You know.
Yeah, well, I just,
Yeah, Thomas, or is that Thomas back there? Yeah.
Quick question on conscience. So you were talking about truth and freedom, and then Professor Kennedy brought up the common ground situation where the congregation was completely wrong on their racist stance, yet they might be correct on the idea of contraception. So how does the church discern from the voices of the faithful what's correct or not? How does conscience come into effect when it's going to be wrong on one thing because we're human, but also right on another because we're also human? So how does the church deal with the split between these and then deal with the huge disparity of opinion in their populace? So if it's a lived experience, how does that work if someone had a dichotomous lived experience? There's a complete split between half and half.
By in the first place arguing the issue and bringing it out into some sort of transparent and when there is disagreement, even taking it over to the point of protest and putting oneself on the line as a counter witness to it. You know, in some ways that's what liberals are doing within the Catholic Church at the moment. Some people are taking hits for the positions that they're holding, but yeah, there's a full range of activity that we choose to stay engaged in. I think there's some great histories of the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s of some of the people that were very much under the modernist condemnations. That they did the best they could to archive what they could, and wherever they could find a conversation to participate in, they tried that. But you know, in some ways, I'd like in my own piece, and I probably should have pushed stronger, there has to be a love for the church and a love for even the people that are so much opposed to my own activity, that I try to again and again and again and engage them. We, of course, have some scriptural things. How many times do you forgive a brother or sister? Well, take that in. How many times do I say, hey, let's again try and talk about this? You know, yeah, if particularly the church came off looking that way in society, they would have far closer hearing on some of the issues that they're trying to push. But yeah.
I introduced John Henry Newman's essay on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine, and I suppose that it would have behooved me to have reread it. So I had it a little more crisply in mind. The fact is, it's been years since I read it. But the very title of the essay is suggestive, I think, of exactly what you're saying, which is Newman's approach on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine, not simply taking into doctrine the observed practice of the faithful, but on having the conversation and honoring, at least to some degree, the actual practice of the faith.
The other thing Newman says in that essay is that it's not the purpose of consulting the faithful is so that the teachers can learn from the faithful. So that the ecclesia docens, the teaching church, becomes the ecclesia decens, the learning church, and so there's a relationship of reciprocity there that Newman was suggesting, and without doing away with the function of teaching and learning. Nevertheless, you arrive at those functions through what we're calling here, what's the exact phrase? Argument, but it's the phrase that came from.
Proclamation is not urgent.
Okay, proclamation is not urgent. That's good. That's what right. But anyway, that's a little bit more on the Newman thing. I saw another question, Loretta. Oh no, wait a minute. I'm sorry. You're second in line. Okay. Beth Ann. Annabeth.
Okay. So my question kind of draws on both what was said about integration in Boston schools as well as the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. It's what's the place of religious liberty and the Catholic Church involved in the politics outside the United States? Because, for example, what comes to mind is the Roman Catholic Church in the Philippines. If we accept that it was right for the Catholic Church to support the Aquinos against the Marcos dictatorship, Is it therefore also right to support the Catholic Church's prohibition on the RH bill passing and the bishop's power over the Filipino government in that sense? Because then can we go, if Aquinos, then RH bill, or can we say that if not one, then the other, or can we say they were right on one thing but wrong on the other? So basically, outside of this American context of religious liberty.
It's also outside of my pay grade.
Yeah.
Well, I might a bit of a shot at that. First of all, I would say, in some respects, I think you can say that they will be right on one and wrong on another. I think, in response to your question and to the gentleman's question, the previous Thomas's question, that I think in ways one thing that would be a wrong move and certainly would contradict someone like Newman would be to think that the church can constrain the Catholic conscience. And there's sort of a paradox there, but I think it's important to sort of affirm, and doctrinally this is the affirmation, that the conscience of the Catholic, in a sense, is always sort of perennially a wild card. It decides things as it must in the light of the sort of empirical data it has before it and the exercise of prudence, and then must follow it. But I think maybe one thing to note is the whole situation in the Philippines, I think, is really interesting right now. And I don't know it in detail, but I think it's very interesting in part because it really tracks what's going on in the United States with the great confrontation now between the bishops and the Health and Human Resources here, which is over contraception, the provision of free contraception, of course, to women in the United States. And it's really the same issue in the Philippines, that whole bill on, which specifically, as I understand, excludes abortion, absolutely off the table, not part of it. It's about the provision of contraception to women, low cost, at no cost, especially to poor women throughout the Philippines. So I think it's just interesting, very striking to note this conflict going on within the church about gender issues, sexuality, and conscience, and then power, the power of all male hierarchy. I don't want to trip away on issues of irony and all of that, because I think that sort of is a little escapist. But it's actually really striking how these things are kind of surfacing all over the place as really powerful issues. I think on that one that, again, in the Philippines, I'd say that I think the church is, in seeking to kind of compel passage or fighting the legislation, is... it's within its prerogative, but I think it's making a profound mistake and will, I think, compound the whole problem of kind of conscience among Catholics throughout the country that much more.
We're going to have to stop it there for the moment. If we want to continue the conversation afterwards, we certainly can. Thank you very much.